Begin by simply listening, slow down, see just how peaceful today can be. Thanks so much for swinging by. You can call me your host, your obedient servant, Sebastian St. Smalls. You're killing me, Smalls. Vincent twice. You can always call me Bennett. The plan for this one is more Jane Eyre read by the San Diego Library lady and more Breath of the Wild Legend of Zelda. Thanks again for swinging by. Wish us luck.
Day 14 of our Read Aloud Together of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And let's see. There's a lot to recap. A lot of good stuff happened last week. But before we go there, let's do a couple of little fun theme things. We call our program Tea with Jane Eyre because it's fun to have a little celebration of tea and just other good things that make us happy, especially things that have been a little weird lately. It is also Monday. So I was thinking last Monday we called it Masked Monday. I've got my mask on again today. I got a different one on. So if you'd like to show us a picture of your mask, I would love to see it. I think they're always fun. We all have different patterns, and that's not pattern of the fabric. The design is also pattern of like how it's sewn together. And so if you'd like to show off your mask, here's mine for today. I'm all polka dotted, little pastels. But yeah, if you'd like to show us a photo of your mask, that would be super fun. Let's see. Today's tea that I'm drinking is a mint loose leaf tea. It's by Wonderful Farms, the now defunct farm from New Hampshire, from the same grower that was making that chocolate mint tea from last week. And it is also very, very aromatic. Let me show you. I did this one in the, there we go, that looks better. I did it in the French press, and like I was saying the other week, it kind of looks fun to get to see the leaves all big. And so when you lift it up, you can see she put some really big leaves in there too. And so, yeah, you can see, whoo, that one's dropping down right now. Reminds me when you go to SeaWorld and you see the manta rays. But let's see. So yeah, there's some really big leaves in here. It smells great. And we're still hoping that maybe we can get a workshop going on, if possible, with Emily's mom. She's somebody I met through the tea group that I'm in. So let's go ahead and pour this out. It has like a really lovely yellow color. I think it has a little bit of green tinge to it. But again, that might just be the power of suggestion because I know it's mint. Whoops. It helps if I turn it around better so it'll actually drain out. Here we go. So yeah, this one also, as soon as I opened up the canister, I could smell it through my mask. It was just really, really nice. This is a good one. That's really lovely. So, today we have mint, and again, if you'd like to share a photo of you and your mask on Minty Mask Monday, or unmasked, masked or unmasked, but it'd be fun to see what you're drinking and what you're wearing today. Okay, so going back to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, we're about to do chapter 17, but let's just recap a little bit of what happened last week. In the last two chapters, some very significant things happened for her. In chapter 15, I'd get my numbers right. In chapter 15, there was a really weird thing that happened where there was a fire that happened in Thornfield Hall. Jane went in and saved Mr. Rochester's life. He was lying in a burning bed while the room was on fire around him. And I forgot to mention this the other time, but again, I'm sure you hopefully remembered it yourself. Afterwards, after that incident, before they parted, Mr. Rochester was holding onto Jane's hand, and he seemed to want to speak with her a bit more, and she was like, I gotta go. It's time to go back to bed. This is getting a little weird. But Mr. Rochester clearly wanted to prolong that conversation. And the next day, when she woke up, so again, now we're back up to chapter 16. When she woke up, she was both dreading seeing him at first, and then as the day progressed, she wanted to see him. She wanted to talk with him. She wanted to talk about what had happened the night before, both what had happened with the incidents of the fire, and also, was he trying to say something more to her? Was there something going on between them, perhaps? And what we find at the end of middle of chapter 16 is that Mr. Rochester has actually left Thornfield Hall. He's gone to another estate, the Lees, the home of the Eshtons, I believe it was, and he's going there to a house party, so he'll be gone for about a week. And while she's talking to Mrs. Fairfax about that, Miss Fairfax mentions that one of the other families in attendance will be the Ingrams, and that, in fact, Blanche Ingram had sort of perhaps been a possible, love interest for Mr. Rochester a while back. And Jane goes back to her room that night And she really harshly and strongly, like, castigates herself for having ever possibly entertained the notion that there could have been something like a spark between her and Mr. Rochester. Because she's heard this description of Blanche Ingram, this beautiful, cultured woman with property, and how could he ever be interested in her, a plain little governess? And so she actually draws a little cameo of what she thinks Blanche Ingram might look like based on the description given by Mrs. Fairfax. And she contrasts it with how she sees herself. And she looks in the mirror and she uses like basic crayons to draw herself with hiding no flaw, showing every little defect that she's ever seen in herself. And she draws this picture and she sees it as like, a plain, poor, basically pathetic, thing. And then she contrasts it to an image of what she thinks, what she imagines is the most beautiful woman she can envision, based on the description given by Mrs. Fairfax about what Blanche Ingram might look like. And she says whenever she dares to hope, dares to think that maybe there was a possibility of something with Mr. Rochester, she needs to compare those two images, her ugly truth versus the beautiful image that she has in her mind of what Mr. Rochester wants and deserves. It's really painful to hear her and see her feel this moment. But she's looking at it as a way she can keep herself strong so she won't be disappointed by what's going on. And so when that chapter closed, she's created those two images, and she says how they're going to give her strength, basically, because that way she'll be prepared for what might come. And so now we're ready to begin chapter 17. After Mr. Rochester's been away, we'll see what happens next at Thornfield Hall in chapter 17 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And again, enjoy your tea.
You're here.
Fortify yourselves. This is going to be a really momentous week in the book. A lot of interesting stuff happens. All right, let's go into chapter 17. A week passed, and no news arrived of Mr. Rochester. 10 days, and still he did not come. Mrs. Fairfax said she should not be surprised if he were to go straight from the Leas to London, and thence to the Continent, and not show his face again at Thornfield for a year to come. He had not unfrequently quitted it in a manner quite as abrupt and unexpected. When I heard this, I was beginning to feel a strange chill and failing at the heart. I was actually permitting myself to experience a sickening sense of disappointment. But rallying my wits and recollecting my principles, I at once called my sensations to order, and it was wonderful how I got over the temporary blunder, how I cleared up the mistake of supposing Mr. Rochester's movements a matter in which I had any cause to take a vital interest. Not that I humbled myself by a slavish notion of inferiority. On the contrary, I just said, "You have nothing to do with the master of Thornfield, further than to receive the salary he gives you for teaching his protege, and to be grateful for such respectful and kind treatment as, if you do your duty, you have a right to expect at his hands. Be sure that is the only tie he seriously acknowledges between you and him. So don't make him the object of your fine feelings, your raptures, agonies, and so forth. He is not of your order. Keep to your caste, and be too self-respecting to lavish the love of the whole heart, soul, and strength, where such a gift is not wanted and would be despised." I went on with my day's business tranquilly, but ever and anon, vague suggestion kept wandering across my brain of reasons why I should quit Thornfield, and I kept involuntarily framing advertisements and pondering conjectures about new situations. These thoughts I did not think it necessary to check. They might germinate and bear fruit if they could. Mr. Rochester had been absent upward of a fortnight when the post brought Mrs. Fairfax a letter. "It is from the master," said she, as she looked at the direction. "Now I suppose we shall know whether we are to expect his return or not." And while she broke the seal and perused the document, I went on taking my coffee. We were at breakfast. It was hot, and I attributed to that circumstance a fiery glow which suddenly rose to my face. Why my hand shook, and why I involuntarily spilled half the contents of my cup into my saucer, I did not choose to consider. "Well, I sometimes think we are too quiet, but we run a chance of being busy enough now, for a little while at least," said Mrs. Fairfax, still holding the note before her spectacles. Ere I permitted myself to request an explanation, I tied the string of Adele's pinafore, which happened to be loose. Having helped her also into another bun and refilled her mug with milk, I said nonchalantly, Mr. Rochester is not likely to return soon, I suppose. Indeed he is.
Good.
In 3 days, he says. That will be
divine
next
place.
Thursday. And not alone
You will
either.
see several glowing
I don't know
points
how
on your
many
map
of the
which
fine people at the
represent
Lees
terminals
are
that
coming with
control
him.
Rita.
He sends directions for all the
Take
best
her back
bedrooms to be
by
prepared,
activating all of
and the
the
library
terminals.
and drawing rooms are to be cleaned out,
careful.
and I am to get more kitchen hands from the George Inn at Millcote and from wherever else I can. And the ladies will bring their maids and the gentlemen their valets, so we shall have a house full of it. And Mrs. Fairfax swallowed her breakfast and hastened away to commence operations. 3 days were, as she foretold, busy enough. I had thought all the rooms at Thornfield beautifully clean and well arranged, but it appears I was mistaken. 3 women were got to help, and such scrubbing, such brushing, such washing of paint and beating of carpets, such taking down and putting up of pictures, such polishing of mirrors and lustres, such lighting of fires in bedrooms and airing of sheets and feather beds on hearths, I never beheld, either before or since. Adele ran quite wild in the midst of it. The preparations for company and the prospect of their arrival seemed to throw her into ecstasies. She would have Sophie to look over all her toilettes, as she called frocks, to furbish up any that were passées, outmoded, and to air and arrange the new. For herself, she did nothing but caper about in front chambers, jumping on and off the bedsteads, and lie on the mattresses and piled up bolsters and pillows before the enormous fires roaring in the chimneys. From school duties, she was exonerated. Mrs. Fairfax had pressed me into her service, and I was all day in the storeroom, helping or hindering her and the cook, learning to make custards and cheesecakes and French pastry to truss game and garnish dessert dishes. The party were expected to arrive on Thursday afternoon in time for dinner at 6. During the intervening period, I had no time to nurse Chimera, and I believe I was as active and gay as anybody, Adele excepted. Still, now and then, I received a damping check to my cheerfulness, and was, in spite of myself, thrown back on the region of doubts and portents and dark conjectures. This was when I chanced to see the third-story staircase door, which of late had always been kept locked, open slowly and give passage to the form of Grace Poole in prim cap, white apron, and handkerchief, while I watched her glide along the gallery, her quiet tread muffled in a list slipper, when I saw her look into the bustling, topsy-turvy bedrooms, just say a word perhaps to the charwomen about the proper way to polish a grate, or clean a marble mantelpiece, or take stains from papered walls, and then pass on. She would thus descend to the kitchen once a day, eat her dinner, smoke a moderate pipe on the hearth, and go back, carrying her pot of porter with her for her private solace in her own gloomy upper haunt. Only 1 hour in the 24 did she pass with her fellow servants below. All the rest of her time was spent in some low-ceilinged oaken chamber of the third story. There she sat and sewed, and probably laughed drearily to herself, as companionless as a prisoner in his dungeon. The strangest thing of all was that not a soul in the house, except me, noticed her habits or seemed to marvel at them. No one discussed her position or enjoyment. No one pitied her solitude or isolation. I once, indeed, overheard a part of a dialogue between Leah and one of the charwomen, of which Grace formed the subject. Leah had been saying something I had not caught, and the charwoman remarked, "She gets good wages, I guess." "Yes," said Leah. "I wish I had as good. Not that mine are to complain of. There's no stinginess at Thornfield, but they're not 1/5 of the sum Mrs. Poole receives. And she is laying by. She goes every quarter to the bank at Millcote. I should not wonder but she has saved enough to keep her independent if she liked to leave. But I suppose she's got used to the place, and then she's not 40 yet, and strong and able for anything. It is too soon for her to give up business." "She's a good hand, I dare say," said the charwoman. "Ah, she understands what she has to do. Nobody better," rejoined Leah, significantly. "And it is not everyone could fill her shoes, not for all the money she gets." "That it is not," was the reply. "I wonder whether Master—" The charwoman was going on, but here Leah turned and perceived me, and she instantly gave her companion a nudge. "Doesn't she know?" I heard the woman whisper. Leah shook her head, and the conversation was, of course, dropped. All I had gathered from it amounted to this, that there was a mystery at Thornfield, and that from participation in that mystery, I was purposely excluded. Thursday came. All work had been completed the previous evening. Carpets were laid down, bed hangings festooned, radiant white counterpanes spread, toilet tables arranged, furniture rubbed, flowers piled in vases. Both chambers and saloons looked as fresh and bright as hands could make them. The hall, too, was scoured, and the great carved clock, as well as the steps and banisters of the staircase, were polished to the brightness of glass. In the dining room, the sideboard flashed resplendent with plate. In the drawing room and boudoir, vases of exotics bloomed on all sides. Afternoon arrived. Mrs. Fairfax assumed her best black satin gown, her gloves, and her gold watch, for it was her part to receive the company, to conduct the ladies to their rooms, etc. Adele, too, would be dressed, though I thought she had little chance of being introduced to the party, that day at least. However, to please her, I allowed Sophie to apparel her in one of her short, full muslin frocks. For myself, I had no need to make any change. I should not be called upon to quit my sanctum of the schoolroom. For a sanctum, it was now becoming to me, a very pleasant refuge in time of trouble. It had been a mild, serene spring day, one of those days which, toward the end of March or the beginning of April, rise shining over the earth as heralds of summer. It was drawing to an end now, but the evening was even warm, and I sat at work in the schoolroom with the window open. "It gets late," said Mrs. Fairfax, entering in rustling state. "I am glad I ordered dinner an hour after the time Mr. Rochester mentioned, for it is past 6 now. I have sent John down to the gates to see if there is anything on the road. One can see a long way from thence in the direction of Millcote." She went to the window. "Here he is," said she. "Well, John," leaning out, "any news?" "They're coming, ma'am," was the answer. "They'll be here in 10 minutes." Adele flew to the window. I followed, taking care to stand on one side so that, screened by the curtain, I could see without being seen. The 10 minutes John had given seemed very long, but at last wheels were heard. Four equestrians galloped up the drive, and after them came 2 open carriages. Fluttering veils and waving plumes filled the vehicles. 2 of the cavaliers were young, dashing-looking gentlemen. The third was Mr. Rochester on his black horse, Mesrour, pilot bounding before him. At his side rode a lady, and he and she were the first of the party. Her purple riding habit almost swept the ground. Her veil streamed long on the breeze, mingling with its transparent folds, and gleaming through them shone rich raven ringlets. "Miss Ingram," explained Mrs. Fairfax, and away she hurried to her post below. The cavalcade, following the sweep of the drive, quickly turned the angle of the house, and I lost sight of it. Adele now petitioned to go down, but I took her on my knee and gave her to understand that she must not on any account think of venturing in sight of the ladies, either now or at any other time, unless expressly sent for, that Mr. Rochester would be very angry, etc. Some natural tears she shed on being told this, but as I began to look very grave, she consented at last to wipe them. A joyous stir was now audible in the hall. Gentlemen's deep tones and ladies' silvery accents blent harmoniously together, and distinguishable above them all, although not loud, was the sonorous voice of the master of Thornfield Hall, welcoming his fair and gallant guests under his roof. Then light steps ascended the stairs, and there was a tripping through the gallery, and soft, cheerful laughs, and opening and closing doors, and for a time, a hush. "Elles changeront des toilettes." "They are changing," said Adele, who, listening attentively, had followed every movement, and she sighed. "Chez maman," said she, quand il y avait du monde, je le suivais partout, au salon et à leur chambre. Souvent, je regardais la femme des chambres coiffure et habillait les dames, et c'était si amusant. Comme cela on apprend. At mamma's, when there were a lot of people, I would follow them everywhere, in the drawing room and to their rooms. Often I would watch the maids dress the ladies and do their hair, and it was so much fun. That's how you learn. "Don't you feel hungry, Adele?" "Mais oui, mademoiselle. Voilà 5 ou 6 heures que nous n'avons pas mangé." "Yes, of course. It's been 5 or 6 hours since we've eaten." Well now, while the ladies are in their room, I will venture down and get you something to eat. And issuing from my asylum with precaution, I sought a back stairs which conducted directly to the kitchen. All in that region was fire and commotion. The soup and fish were in the last stage of projection, and the cook hung over crucibles in a frame of mind and body, threatening spontaneous combustion. In the servants' hall, 2 coachmen and 3 gentlemen's gentlemen stood or sat round the fire. The Abigails, I suppose, were upstairs with their mistresses. The new servants that had been hired from Millcote were bustling about everywhere. Threading this chaos, I at last reached the larder. There I took possession of a cold chicken, a roll of bread, some tarts, a plate or 2, and a knife and fork. With this booty, I made a hasty retreat. I had regained the gallery and was just shutting the back door behind me when an accelerated hum warned me that the ladies were about to issue from their chambers. I could not proceed to the schoolroom without passing some of their doors and running the risk of being surprised with my cargo of victualage, so I stood still at the end, which, being windowless, was dark, quite dark now, for the sun was set and twilight gathering. Presently the chambers gave up their fair tenants one after another. Each came out gaily and airily, with dress that gleamed lustrous through the dusk. For a moment they stood grouped together at the other extremity of the gallery, conversing in a key of sweet, subdued vivacity. Then they descended the staircase, almost as noiselessly as a bright mist rolls down a hill. Their collective appearance had left on me an impression of high-born elegance, such as I had never before received. I found Adele peeping through the schoolroom door, which she held ajar. "What beautiful ladies!" cried she in English. "Oh, I wish I might go to them. Do you think Mr. Rochester will send for us by and by, after dinner?" "No, indeed, I don't. Mr. Rochester has something else to think about. Never mind the ladies tonight. Perhaps you will see them tomorrow. Here is your dinner." She was really hungry, so the chicken and tarts served to divert her attention for a time. It was well I secured this forage, or both she, I, and Sophie, to whom I conveyed a share of our repast, would have had to run a chance of getting no dinner at all. Everyone downstairs was too much engaged to think of us. The dessert was not carried out till after 9, and at 10, footmen were still
Just
running
one
to and
time
fro
in
with
vain.
trays and coffee
I
cups.
have faith in
I allowed Adele to sit up much later than usual, for she declared she could not possibly go to sleep while the doors kept opening and shutting below and people bustling about. Besides, she added, a message might possibly come from Mr. Rochester when she was undressed. Et alors, quel dommage! And then, what a shame! I told her stories as long as she would listen to them, and then, for a change, I took her out into the gallery. The hall lamp was now lighted, and it amused her to look over the balustrade and watch the servants passing backward and forward. When the evening was far advanced, a sound of music issued from the drawing-room, whither the piano had been removed. Adele and I sat down on the top step of the stairs to listen. Presently, a voice blent with the rich tones of the instrument. It was a lady who sang, and very sweet her notes were. The solo over, a duet followed, and then a glee. A joyous conversational murmur filled up the intervals. I listened long. Suddenly I discovered that my ears were wholly intent on analyzing the mingled sounds and trying to discriminate amidst the confusion of accents those of Mr. Rochester. And when it caught them, which it soon did, it found a further task in framing the tones, rendered by distance inarticulate, into words. The clock struck 11. I looked at Adele, whose head leaned against my shoulder. Her eyes were waxing heavy, so I took her up in my arms and carried her off to bed. It was near 1 before the gentlemen and ladies sought their chambers. The next day was as fine as its predecessor. It was devoted by the party to an excursion to some site in the neighborhood. They set out early in the forenoon, some on horseback, the rest in carriages. I witnessed both the departure and the return. Miss Ingram, as before, was the only lady equestrienne, and as before, Mr. Rochester galloped at her side. The two rode a little apart from the rest. I pointed out the circumstance to Mrs. Fairfax, who was standing at the window with me. "You said it was not likely they should think of being married," said I, "but you see, Mr. Rochester evidently prefers her to any of the other ladies." Yes, I dare say. No doubt he admires her. And she him, I added. Look how she leans her head towards him, as if she were conversing confidentially. I wish I could see her face. I've never had a glimpse of it yet. You will see her this evening, answered Mrs. Fairfax. I happened to remark to Mr. Rochester how much Adele wished to be introduced to the ladies, and he said, "Oh, let her come into the drawing-room after dinner, and request Miss Eyre to accompany her." Yes, he said that from mere politeness. I need not go, I am sure, I observed. Well, I observed to him that as you were unused to company, I did not think you would like appearing before so gay a party, all strangers, and he replied in his quick way, "Nonsense. If she objects, tell her it is my particular wish, and if she resists, say I shall come and fetch her in case of contumacy." I will not give him that trouble, I answered. I will go, if no better may be, but I don't like it. Shall you be there, Mrs. Fairfax? No, I pleaded off, and he admitted my plea. I'll tell you how to manage so as to avoid the embarrassment of making a formal entrance, which is the most disagreeable part of the business. You must go into the drawing room while it is empty, before the ladies leave the dining room. Choose your seat in any quiet nook you like. You need not stay long after the gentlemen come in, unless you please. Just let Mr. Rochester see you are there, and then slip away. Nobody will notice you. Will these people remain long, do you think? Perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, certainly no more. After the Easter recess, Sir George Lynn, who was lately elected member for Millcote, will have to go up to town and take his seat. I dare say Mr. Rochester will accompany him. It surprises me that he has already made so protracted a stay at Thornfield. It was with some trepidation that I perceived the hour approach when I was to repair with my charge to the drawing-room. Adele had been in a state of ecstasy all day after hearing she was to be presented to the ladies in the evening, and it was not till Sophie commenced the operation of dressing her that she sobered down. Then the importance of the process quickly steadied her, and by the time she had her curls arranged in well-smoothed, drooping clusters, her pink satin frock on, her long sash tied, and her lace mittens adjusted, she looked as grave as any judge. No need to warn her not to disarrange her attire. When she was dressed, she sat demurely down in her little chair, taking care previously to lift up the satin skirt for fear she should crease it, and assured me she would not stir thence until I was ready. This I quickly was. My best dress, the silver gray one purchased for Miss Temple's wedding and never worn since, was soon put on. My hair was soon smoothed. My sole ornament, the pearl brooch, soon assumed. We descended. Fortunately, there was another entrance to the drawing room than that through the saloon where they were all seated at dinner. We found the apartment vacant, a large fire burning silently on the marble hearth, and wax candles shining in bright solitude amid the exquisite flowers with which the tables were adorned. The crimson curtain hung before the arch, slight as was the separation as drapery formed from the party in the adjoining saloon. They spoke in so low a key that nothing of their conversation could be distinguished beyond a soothing murmur. Adele, who appeared to be still under the influence of a most solemnizing impression, sat down without a word on the footstool I pointed out to her. I retired to a window seat, and taking a book from a table near, endeavored to read. Adele brought her stool to my feet. Ere long, she touched my knee. What is it, Adele? Est-ce que je ne puis pas prendre une seule de ces fleurs magnifiques, mademoiselle? Seulement pour compléter ma toilette. May I just take one of these magnificent flowers, just to add the finishing touch to my outfit? You think too much of your toilette, Adele, but you may have a flower. And I took a rose from a vase and fastened it in her sash. She sighed a sigh of ineffable satisfaction, as if her cup of happiness were now full. I turned my face away to conceal a smile I could not suppress. There was something ludicrous as well as painful in the little Parisienne's earnest and innate devotion to matters of dress. A soft sound of rising now became audible. The curtain was swept back from the arch. Through it appeared the dining room, with its lighted luster pouring down light on the silver and glass of a magnificent dessert service, covering a long table. A band of ladies stood in the opening. They entered, and the curtain fell behind them. They were but 8, yet somehow, as they flocked in, they gave the impression of a much larger number. Some of them were very tall, many were dressed in white, and all had a sweeping amplitude of array that seemed to magnify their persons as a mist magnifies the moon. I rose and curtsied to them. 1 or 2 bent their heads in return, and others only stared at me. They dispersed about the room, reminding me, by the lightness and buoyancy of their movements, of a flock of white, plumy birds. Some of them threw themselves in half-reclining positions on the sofas and ottomans. Some bent over the tables and examined the flowers and books. The rest gathered in a group round the fire. All talked in a low but clear tone, which seemed habitual to them. I knew their names afterwards, and may as well mention them now. First, there was Mrs. Eshton and 2 of her daughters. She had evidently been a handsome woman, and was well preserved still. Of her daughters, the eldest, Amy, was rather little, naive and childlike in face and manner, and piquant in form. Her white muslin dress and blue sash became her well. The second, Louisa, was taller and more elegant in figure, with a very pretty face, of that order the French term minois chiffonné, a funny little face. Both sisters were fair as lilies. Lady Lynn was a large and stout personage of about 40, very erect, very haughty-looking, richly dressed in a satin robe of changeful sheen. Her dark hair shone glossily under the shade of an azure plume, and within a circlet of a band of gems. Mrs. Colonel Dent was less showy, but I thought more ladylike. She had a slight figure, a pale, gentle face, and fair hair. Her black satin dress, her scarf of rich foreign lace, and her pearl ornaments pleased me better than the rainbow radiance of the titled dame. But the 3 most distinguished, partly perhaps because the tallest figures of the band, were the Dowager Lady Ingram and her daughters, Blanche and Mary. They were all 3 of the loftiest stature of woman. The Dowager might be between 40 and 50. Her shape was still fine, her hair, by candlelight at least, still black. Her teeth, too, were still apparently perfect. Most people would have termed her a splendid woman of her age, and so she was, no doubt, physically speaking. But then there was an expression of almost insupportable haughtiness in her bearing and countenance. She had Roman features and a double chin, disappearing into a throat like a pillar. These features appeared to me not only inflated and darkened, but even furrowed with pride. And the chin was sustained by the same principle in a position of almost preternatural erectness. She had likewise a fierce and a hard eye. It reminded me of Mrs. Reed's. She mouthed her words in speaking. Her voice was deep, its inflections very pompous, very dogmatical, very intolerable, in short. A crimson velvet robe and a shawl turban of some gold-wrought Indian fabric invested her, I suppose she thought, with a truly imperial dignity. Blanche and Mary were of equal stature, straight and tall as poplars. Mary was too slim for her height, but Blanche was molded like a Diana. I regarded her, of course, with special interest. First, I wished to see whether her appearance accorded with Mrs. Fairfax's description. Secondly, whether it at all resembled the fancy miniature I had painted of her. And thirdly, it will out, whether it were such as I should fancy likely to suit Mr. Rochester's taste. As far as person went, she answered point for point, both to my picture and Mrs. Fairfax's description. The noble bust, the sloping shoulders, the graceful neck, the dark eyes and black ringlets were all there. But her face? Her face was like her mother's, a youthful, unfurrowed likeness. The same low brow, the same high features, the same pride. It was not, however, so saturnine a pride. She laughed continually. Her laugh was satirical, and so was the habitual expression of her arched and haughty lip. Genius is said to be self-conscious. I cannot tell whether Miss Ingram was a genius, but she was self-conscious. Remarkably self-conscious indeed. She entered into a discourse on botany with the gentle Mrs. Dent. It seems Mrs. Dent had not studied that science, though, as she said, she liked flowers, especially wild ones. Miss Ingram had, and she ran over its vocabulary with an air. I presently perceived she was, what is vernacularly termed, trailing Mrs. Dent, that is, playing on her ignorance. Her trail might be clever, but it was decidedly not good-natured. She played. Her execution was brilliant. She sang. Her voice was fine. She talked French apart to her mama, and she talked it well, with fluency and with a good accent. Mary had a milder and more open countenance than Blanche, softer features too, and a skin some shades fairer. Miss Ingram was dark as a Spaniard. But Mary was deficient in life. Her face lacked expression, her eye luster. She had nothing to say, and having once taken her seat, remained fixed like a statue in its niche. The sisters were both attired in spotless white. And did I now think Miss Ingram such a choice as Mr. Rochester would be likely to make? I could not tell. I did not know his taste in female beauty. If he liked the majestic, she was the very type of majesty. Then she was so accomplished, sprightly. Most gentlemen would admire her, I thought. And that he did admire her, I already seemed to have obtained proof. To remove the last shade of doubt, it remained but to see them together. You are not to suppose, reader, that Adele has all this time been sitting motionless on the stool at my feet. No. When the ladies entered, she rose, advanced to meet them, made a stately reverence, and said with gravity, "Bonjour, mesdames." Hello, ladies. And Miss Ingram had looked down at her with a mocking air and exclaimed, "Oh, what a little puppet!" Lady Lynn had remarked, "It is Mr. Rochester's ward, I suppose, the little French girl he was speaking of." Mrs. Dent had kindly taken her hand and given her a kiss. Amy and Louisa Eshton had cried out simultaneously, "What a love of a child!" And then they had called her to a sofa where she now sat, ensconced between them, chattering alternatively in French and broken English, absorbing not only the young lady's attention, but that of Mrs. Eshton and Lady Lynn, and getting spoiled to her heart's content. At last coffee is brought in, and the gentlemen are summoned. I sit in the shade, if any shade there be in this brilliantly lighted apartment. The window curtain half hides me. Again the arch yawns. They come. The collective appearance of the gentlemen, like that of the ladies, is very imposing. They are all costumed in black. Most of them are tall, some young. Henry and Frederick Lynn are very dashing sparks indeed, and Colonel Dent is a fine soldierly man. Mr. Eshton, the magistrate of the district, is gentlemanlike. His hair is quite white, his eyebrows and whiskers still dark, which gives him something of the appearance of a père noble de théâtre, a distinguished old gentleman of the kind found in the theatre. Lord Ingram, like his sisters, is very tall. Like them, also, he is handsome, but he shares Mary's apathetic and listless look. He seems to have more length of limb than vivacity of blood or vigor of brain. And where is Mr. Rochester? He comes in last. I am not looking at the arch, yet I see him enter. I try to concentrate my attention on these netting needles, on the meshes of the purse I am forming. I wish to think only of the work I have in my hands, to see only the silver beads and silk threads that lie in my lap, whereas I distinctly behold his figure, and I inevitably recall the moment when I last saw it, just after I had rendered him what he deemed an essential service. And he, holding my hand and looking down on my face, surveyed me with eyes that revealed a heart full and eager to overflow, in whose emotions I had a hurt. How near had I approached him at that moment? What had occurred since, calculated to change his and my relative positions? Yet now, how distant, how estranged we were, so far estranged that I did not expect him to come and speak to me. I did not wonder when, without looking at me, he took a seat at the other side of the room and began conversing with some of the ladies.
Not much room to operate.
No sooner did I see that his attention was riveted on them and that I might gaze without being observed than my eyes were drawn involuntarily to his face. I could not keep their lids under control. They would rise, and the irids would fix on him. I looked and had an acute pleasure in looking, a precious yet poignant pleasure, pure gold with a steely point of agony, a pleasure like what the thirst-perishing man might feel who knows the well to which he has crept is poisoned, yet stoops and drinks divine draughts nevertheless. Most true is it that beauty is in the eye of the gazer. My master's colorless, olive face, square, massive brow, broad and jetty eyebrows, deep eyes, strong features, firm, grim mouth, all energy, decision, will, were not beautiful according to rule, but they were more than beautiful to me. They were full of an interest, an influence that quite mastered me, that took my feelings from my own power and fettered them in his. I had not intended to love him. The reader knows I had wrought hard to extirpate from my soul the germs of love there detected, and now, at the first renewed view of him, they spontaneously revived, green and strong. He had made me love him without looking at me. I compared him with his guests. What was the gallant grace of the Lynns, the languid elegance of Lord Ingram, even the military distinction of Colonel Dent, contrasted with his look of native pith and genuine power? I had no sympathy in their appearance, their expression, yet I could imagine that most observers would call them attractive, handsome, imposing, while they would pronounce Mr. Rochester at once harsh-featured and melancholy-looking. I saw them smile, laugh. It was nothing. The light of the candles had as much soul in it as their smile, the tinkle of the bell as much significance as their laugh. I saw Mr. Rochester smile. His stern features softened. His eye grew both brilliant and gentle, its ray both searching and sweet. He was talking at the moment to Louisa and Amy Eshton. I wondered to see them receive with calm that look which seemed to me so penetrating.
Catherine.
I expected their eyes to fall, their color to rise under it. Yet I was glad when I found they were in no sense moved. He is not to them what he is to me, I thought. He is not of their kind. I believe he is of mine. I am sure he is. I feel akin to him. I understand the language of his countenance and movements. Though rank and wealth sever us widely, I have something in my brain and heart, in my blood and nerves, that assimilates me mentally to him. Did I say a few days since that I had nothing to do with him but to receive my salary at his hands? Did I forbid myself to think of him in any other light than as a paymaster? Blasphemy against nature. Every good, true, vigorous feeling I have gathers impulsively round him. I know I must conceal my sentiments. I must smother hope. I must remember that he cannot care much for me. For when I say that I am not of his kind, I do not mean that I have his force to influence and his spell to attract. I mean only that I have certain tastes and feelings in common with him. I must then repeat continually that we are forever sundered. And yet while I breathe and think, I must love him. Coffee is handed.
Catherine.
The ladies, since the gentlemen entered, have become lively as larks. Conversation waxes brisk and merry. Colonel Dent and Mr. Eshton argue on politics. Their wives listen. The two proud dowagers, Lady Lynn and Lady Ingram, confabulate together. Sir George, whom, by the by, I have forgotten to describe, a very big and very fresh-looking country gentleman, stands before the sofa, coffee cup in hand, and occasionally puts in a word. Mr. Frederick Lynn has taken a seat beside Mary Ingram and is showing her the engravings of a splendid volume. She looks, smiles now and then, but apparently says little. The tall and phlegmatic Lord Ingram leans with folded arms on the chair back of the little and lively Lady Amy Eshton. She glances up at him and chatters like a wren. She likes him better than she does Mr. Rochester. Henry Lynn has taken possession of an ottoman at the feet of Louisa. Adele shares it with him. He is trying to talk French with her, and Louisa laughs at his blunders. With whom will Blanche Ingram repair? She is standing alone at the table, bending gracefully over an album. She seems waiting to be sought, but she will not wait too long. She herself selects a mate. Mr. Rochester, having quitted the Eshtons, stands on the hearth as solitary as she stands by the table. She confronts him, taking her station on the opposite side of the mantelpiece. Mr. Rochester, I thought you were not fond of children. Nor am I. Then, what induced you to take charge of such a little doll as that? Pointing to Adele. Where did you pick her up? I did not pick her up. She was left on my hands. You should have sent her to school. I could not afford it. Schools are so dear. Why, I suppose you have a governess for her. I saw a person with her just now. Is she gone? Oh, no, there she is, still behind the window curtain. You pay her, of course. I should think it quite as expensive. More so, for you have them both to keep in addition. I feared, or should I say hoped, the allusion to me would make Mr. Rochester glance my way, and I involuntarily shrunk further into the shade, but he never turned his eyes. I have not considered the subject, said he, indifferently, looking straight before him. No, you men never do consider economy and common sense. You should hear Mamma on the chapter of governesses. Mary and I have had, I should think, a dozen at least in our day, half of them detestable, and the rest ridiculous, and all incubi. Were they not, Mamma? Did you speak, my own? The young lady thus claimed as the dowager's special property reiterated her question with an explanation. Oh, my dearest, don't mention governesses. The word makes me nervous. I have suffered a martyrdom from their incompetency and caprice. I thank heaven I have now done with them. Mrs. Dent now bent over to the pious lady and whispered something in her ear. I suppose from the answer elicited, it was a reminder that one of the anathematized race was present. Tant pis. Too bad, said her ladyship. I hope it may do her good. Then in a lower tone, but still loud enough for me to hear. I noticed her. I am a judge of physiognomy, and in hers I see all the faults of her class. What are they, madam? Inquired Mr. Rochester aloud. I will tell you in your private ear, replied she, wagging her turban 3 times with portentous significancy. But my curiosity will be past its appetite. It craves food now. Ask Blanche. She is nearer you than I. Oh, don't refer him to me, Mamma. I have just one word to say of the whole tribe. They are a nuisance. Not that I ever suffered much from them. I took care to turn the tables. What tricks Theodore and I used to play on our Miss Wilsons and Miss Grays and Madame Joubert. Mary was always too sleepy to join in a plot with spirit. The best fun was with Madame Joubert. Miss Wilson was a sickly, poor thing, lachrymose and low-spirited, not worth the trouble of vanquishing, in short. And Mrs. Gray was coarse and insensible. No blow took effect on her. But poor Madame de Joubert, I see her yet in her raging passions when we had driven her to extremities, spilled our tea, crumpled our bread and butter, tossed our books up to the ceiling, and played a charivari with the ruler and desk, the fender and fire irons. Theodore, do you remember those merry days? Yes, to be sure I do, drawled Lord Ingram. And the poor old stick used to cry out, "Oh, you villains, childs!" And then we sermonized her on the presumption of attempting to teach such clever blades as we were, when she herself so ignorant. We did. And Tato, you know, I helped you in persecuting your tutor, way-faced Mr. Vining, the parson in the pip, as we used to call him. He and Miss Wilson took the liberty of falling in love with each other. At least, Tato and I thought so. We surprised sundry tender glances and sighs, which we interpreted as tokens of la belle passion, the beautiful passion. And I promise you the public soon had the benefit of our discovery. We employed it as a sort of lever to hoist our dead weights from the house. Dear Mamma, there, as soon as she got an inkling of the business, found out that it was of an immoral tendency. Did you not, my lady mother? Certainly, my best. And I was quite right, depend on that. There are 1,000 reasons why liaisons between governesses and tutors should never be tolerated a moment in any well-regulated house. Firstly, oh, gracious Mamma, spare us the enumeration. Oh, rest. At any rate, we all know them. Danger of bad example to innocence of childhood, distractions and consequent neglect of duty on the part of the attached, mutual alliance and reliance, confidence thence resulting, insolence accompanying, mutiny, and general blow-up. Am I right, Baroness Ingram of Ingram Park? My lily flower, you are right now, as always. Then, no more need to be said. Change the subject. Amy Eshton, not hearing or not heeding this dictum, joined in with her soft, infantile tone. Louisa and I used to quiz our governess too, but she was such a good creature. She would bear anything. Nothing put her out. She was never cross with us, was she, Louisa? No, never. We might do what we pleased, ransack her desk and her workbox, and turn her drawers inside out, and she was so good-natured she would give us anything we asked for. I suppose now, said Miss Ingram, curling her lips sarcastically, we shall have an abstract on the memoirs of all the governesses extant. In order to avoid such a visitation, I again move the introduction of a new topic. Mr. Rochester, do you second my motion? Madam, I support you on this point as on every other. Then on me be the onus of bringing it forward. Signor Eduardo, are you in voice tonight? Donna Bianca, if you command it, I will be. Then, signore, I lay on you my sovereign behest to furbish up your lungs and other vocal organs, as they will be wanted on my royal service. Who would not be the Rizzio of so divine a Mary? A fig for Rizzio, cried she, tossing her head with all its curls as she moved to the piano. It is my opinion the fiddler David must have been an insipid sort of fellow. I like Black Bothwell better. To my mind, a man is nothing without a spice of the devil in him, and history may well say what it will of James Hepburn, but I have a notion he was just that sort of wild, fierce, bandit hero whom I could have consented to gift with my hand. Gentlemen, you hear. Now which of you most resembles Bothwell? Cried Mr. Rochester. I should say the preference lies with you, responded Colonel Dent. On my honor, I am much obliged to you, was the reply. Miss Ingram, who had now seated herself with proud grace at the piano, spreading out her snowy robes in queenly amplitude, commenced a brilliant prelude, talking meantime. She appeared to be on her high horse tonight. Both her words and her air seemed intended to excite not only the admiration, but the amazement of her auditors. She was evidently bent on striking them as something very dashing and daring indeed. Oh, I am so sick of the young men of the present day, exclaimed she, rattling away at the instrument. Poor, puny things, not fit to stir a step beyond papa's park gates, nor to go even so far without mamma's permission and guardianship. Creatures so absorbed in care about their pretty faces and their white hands and their small feet, as if a man had anything to do with beauty, as if loveliness were not the special prerogative of woman, her legitimate appanage and heritage. I grant an ugly woman is a blot on the fair face of creation, but as to the gentlemen, let them be solicitous to possess only strength and valor. Let their motto be, hunt, shoot, and fight. The rest is not worth a fillip. Such should be my device were I a man. Whenever I marry, she continued, after a pause which none interrupted, I am resolved my husband shall not be a rival, but a foil to me. I will suffer no competitor near the throne. I shall exact an undivided homage. His devotions shall not be shared between me and the shape he sees in his mirror. Mr. Rochester, now sing, and I will play for you. I am all obedience, was the response. Here, then, is a corsair song. Know that I dote on corsairs, pirates. And for that reason, sing it con spirito. Commands from Miss Ingram's lips would put spirit into a mug of milk and water. Take care, then. If you don't please me, I will shame you by showing how such things should be done. That is offering a premium on incapacity. I shall now endeavor to fail. Gardez-vous en bien. Be very careful. If you err willfully, I shall devise a proportionate punishment. Miss Ingram ought to be clement, for she has it in her power to inflict a chastisement beyond mortal endurance. Ha! Explain, commanded the lady. Pardon me, madam. No need of explanations. Your own fine sense must inform you that one of your frowns would be a sufficient substitute for capital punishment. Sing, said she, and again touching the piano, she commenced an accompaniment in spirited style. Now is my time to slip away, thought I. But the tones that then severed the air arrested me. Mrs. Fairfax had said Mr. Rochester possessed a fine voice. He did. A mellow, profound bass, into which he threw his own feeling, his own force. finding a way through the ear to the heart, and there waking sensations strangely. I waited till the last deep and full vibration had expired, till the tide of talk, checked an instant, had resumed its flow. I then quitted my sheltered corner and made my exit by the side door, which was fortunately near. Thence a narrow passage led into the hall. In crossing it, I perceived my sandal was loose. I stooped to tie it, kneeling down for that purpose on the mat at the foot of the staircase. I heard the dining room door unclose. A gentleman came out. Rising hastily, I stood face to face with him. It was Mr. Rochester. "How do you do?" he asked. "I am very well, sir." "Why did you not come and speak to me in the room?" I thought I might have retorted the question on him who put it, but I would not take that freedom. I answered, "I did not wish to disturb you, as you seem engaged, sir." "What have you been doing during my absence?" "Nothing particular. Teaching Adele as usual." "And getting a great deal paler than you were, as I saw at first sight. What is the matter?" "Nothing at all, sir." "Did you take any cold that night you half drowned me?" "Not the least." "Return to the drawing room. You are deserting too early." "I am tired, sir." He looked at me for a minute. "And a little depressed," he said. "What about? Tell me." Nothing, sir. I am not depressed." "But I affirm that you are. So much depressed that a few more words would bring tears to your eyes. Indeed, they are there now, shining and swimming, and a bead has slipped from the lash and fallen onto the flag. If I had time and was not in mortal dread of some prating prig of a servant passing, I would know what all this means. Well, tonight I excuse you, but understand that so long as my visitors stay, I expect you to appear in the drawing room every evening. It is my wish. Don't neglect it. Now go, and send Sophie for Adele. Good night, my..." And he stopped, bit his lip, and abruptly left me. And that concludes Chapter 17 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I look forward to seeing you guys again tomorrow. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And if you haven't done it yet and you would like to, feel free to post below about what you're drinking, or snacking on, or reading, or even post a picture of what mask you're wearing today. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye! Hi folks, it's Christina, the branch manager of the Pacific Beach Library again. We are on day 15 of Tea with Jane Eyre. That means we've been reading together for 3 whole weeks now, so yay, thank you so much. I'm glad to do this with you. I'm glad you can be here for it. Today's tea is a little unusual. I decided instead of brewing a whole big pot of tea, I was just gonna have, it's this instant ginger tea. I cheated a little, but yeah, it's like I think it's from China. It says Singapore on it. So yeah, it's a combination of, the ingredients are only ginger and rock sugar. So basically it's the kind of stuff I like to drink when I have a cold, which I do not have right now. But I was just craving the taste of ginger and I wanted something, as usual, very sweet. So this one, it's kind of almost cloudy looking. You can kind of see that one, but it's just because you pour in a packet. I'll show you what it looks like so you can see. It's like a little packet of like this gingery sugar, and then you just pour the hot water over it and dissolve it in. But it's, I don't know, if you like the taste of ginger, which I do, it's really good. It's delicious. To me, especially because I tend to drink ginger teas a lot when I'm sick, it just feels comforting and warm and nice, you know? All right, so today, before we get started on chapter 18 already of Jane Eyre, we'll just recap a little bit about where we were at. In chapter 16, I think it was, Jane admitted she had feelings for Mr. Rochester, and then he disappeared. He went somewhere else to a house party. In chapter 17, he returned to Thornfield Hall, and with him he brought a bunch of different guests, including Miss Blanche Ingram, the woman that Jane has heard. There might be a potential romantic interest for Mr. Rochester. And so she is observing and watching and trying to keep her feelings guarded. But of course, as soon as she sees Mr. Rochester again, she feels all the love she has for him, and she's really a little bit heartbroken about how difficult it is to see him in this other situation and to not have the conversations and the intimacy that they'd been sharing before he left Thornfield Hall. And so where we left off in that chapter was that he had there'd been almost like a little musicale at the end of the evening. They'd been singing, they'd been the different guests, and she had walked out, and Mr. Rochester had found her in the hall and said, "You should come on back." And she said no, and he said, "It looks like you're a little depressed," and she said no, and he saw a tear fall from her eye, but she's like, "I'm fine," and eventually he let her leave. So it's a new day. It's chapter 18 in Jane Eyre, and this one is a much shorter chapter. Thank you for bearing with me yesterday. That was a really long one. This will be a lot quicker. We are ready for chapter 18 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Merry days were these at Thornfield Hall, and busy days too. How different from the first 3 months of stillness, monotony, and solitude I had passed beneath its roof. All sad feelings seemed now driven from the house, all gloomy associations forgotten. There was life everywhere, movement all day long. You could not now traverse the gallery, once so hushed, nor enter the front chamber, once so tenantless, without encountering a smart lady's maid or a dandy valet. The kitchen, the butler's pantry, the servants' hall, the entrance hall were equally alive, and the saloons were only left void and still when the blue sky and halcyon sunshine of the genial spring weather called their occupants out into the grounds. Even when that weather was broken and continuous rain set in for some days, no damp seemed cast over enjoyment. Indoor amusements only became more lively and varied in consequence of the stop put to outdoor gaiety. I wondered what they were going to do the first evening a change of entertainment, charades, but in my ignorance I did not understand the term. The servants were called in, the dining room tables wheeled away, the lights otherwise disposed, the chairs placed in a semicircle over opposite the arch. While Mr. Rochester and the other gentlemen directed these alterations, the ladies were running up and down stairs, ringing for their maids. Mrs. Fairfax was summoned to give information respecting the resources of the house in shawls, dresses, draperies of any kind, and certain wardrobes of the third story were ransacked, and their contents, in the shape of brocaded and hooped petticoats, satin sacks, black modes, lace lappets, etc., were brought down in armfuls by the Abigails. Then a selection was made, and such things as were chosen were carried to the boudoir within the drawing-room. Meanwhile, Mr. Rochester had again summoned the ladies round him, and was selecting certain of their number to be of his party. "Miss Ingram is mine, of course," said he. Afterward, he named the two Mrs. Eshton and Mrs. Dent. He looked at me. I happened to be near him as I had been fastening the clasps of Mrs. Dent's bracelet, which had got loose. "Will you play?" he asked. I shook my head. He did not insist, which I rather feared he would have done. He allowed me to return quietly to my usual seat. He and his aides now withdrew behind the curtain. The other party, which was headed by Colonel Dent, sat down on the crescent of chairs. One of the gentlemen, Mr. Eshton, observing me, seemed to propose that I should be asked to join them, but Lady Ingram instantly negatived the notion. "No," I heard her say. "She looks too stupid for any game of the sort." Ere long a bell tinkled, and the curtain drew up. Within the arch, the bulky figure of Sir George Lynn, whom Mr. Rochester had likewise chosen, was seen enveloped in a white sheet. Before him on a table lay open a large book, and at his side stood Amy Eshton, draped in Mr. Rochester's cloak, and holding a book in her hand. Somebody, unseen, rung the bell merrily. Then Adele, who had insisted on being part of her guardian's party, bounded forward, scattering round her the contents of a basket of flowers she carried on her arm. Then appeared the magnificent feature of Miss Ingram, clad in white, a long veil on her head, and a wreath of roses round her brow. By her side walked Mr. Rochester, and together they drew near the table. They kneeled, while Mr. Dent and Louisa Eshton, dressed also in white, took up their stations behind them. A ceremony followed in dumb show, in which it was easy to recognize the pantomime of a marriage. At its termination, Colonel Dent and his party consulted in whispers for 2 minutes. Then the colonel called out, "Bride!" Mr. Rochester bowed, and the curtain fell. A considerable interval elapsed before it rose again. Its second rising displayed a more elaborately prepared scene than the last. The drawing room, as I have before observed, was raised 2 steps. Placed a yard or 2 back of the room, appeared a large marble basin, which I recognized as an ornament of the conservatory, where it usually stood surrounded by exotics and tenanted by goldfish, and whence it might have been transported with some trouble on account of its size and weight. Seated on the carpet by the side of this basin was seen Mr. Rochester, costumed and shawled, with a turban on his head. His dark eyes and swarth skin and painted features suited the costume of an Eastern emir, an agent or a victim of the bowstring. Presently advanced into view Miss Ingram. She too was attired in Oriental fashion. The crimson scarf tied sash-like round the waist, an embroidered handkerchief knotted about her temples, her beautifully molded arms bare, one of them upraised in the act of supporting a pitcher, poised gracefully on her head. Both her cast of form and feature, her complexion and her general air, suggested the idea of some Israelitish princess of the patriarchal days, and such was doubtless the character she intended to represent. She approached the basin and bent over it as if to fill her pitcher. She again lifted it to her head. The personage on the well brink now seemed to accost her, to make some request. She hasted, let down her pitcher on her hand, and gave him to drink. From the bosom of his robe he then produced a casket, opened it, and showed magnificent bracelets and earrings. She acted astonishment and admiration. Kneeling, he laid the treasure at her feet. Incredulity and delight were expressed by her looks and gestures. The stranger fastened the bracelets on her arms and the rings in her ears. It was Eliezer and Rebecca. The camels only were wanting. The divided party again laid their heads together. Apparently they could not agree about the word or syllable the scene illustrated. Colonel Dent, their spokesman, demanded the tableau of the whole, whereupon the curtain again descended. On its third rising, only a portion of the drawing room was disclosed, the rest being concealed by a screen, hung with some sort of dark and coarse drapery.
Vivaldi's gale
The marble
is now
basin was removed. In its place stood a deal table and a kitchen chair. These objects were visible by a very dim light proceeding from a horn lantern, the wax candles being all extinguished. Amid this sordid scene sat a man with his clenched hands resting on his knees and his eyes bent on the ground. I knew Mr. Rochester, though the begrimed face, the disordered dress, his coat hanging loose from one arm as if it had been almost torn from his back in a scuffle, the desperate and scowling countenance, the rough, bristling hair might well have disguised him. As he moved, a chain clanked. To his wrist were attached fetters. "Bridewell!" "It's a prison," exclaimed Colonel Dent, and the charade was solved. A sufficient interval having elapsed for the performers to resume their ordinary costume, they re-entered the dining room. Mr. Rochester led in Miss Ingram. She was complimenting him on his acting. "Do you know," said she, "that of the 3 characters, I liked you in the last best? Oh, had you but lived a few years earlier, what a gallant gentleman highwayman you would have made." "Is all the soot washed from my face?" he asked, turning it toward her. "Alas, yes, the more's the pity. Nothing could be more becoming to your complexion than that ruffian's rouge." "You would like a hero of the road, then?" "An English hero of the road would be the next best thing to an Italian bandit, and that could only be surpassed by a Levantine pirate." "Well, whatever I am, remember you are my wife. We were married an hour since in the presence of all these witnesses." She giggled, and her color rose. "Now, Dent," continued Mr. Rochester, "it is your turn." And as the other party withdrew, he and his band took the vacated seats. Miss Ingram placed herself at her leader's right hand. The other diviners filled the chairs on each side of him and her. I did not now watch the actors. I no longer waited with interest for the curtain to rise. My attention was absorbed by the spectators. My eyes, erewhile fixed on the arch, were now irresistibly attracted to the semicircle of chairs. What charade Colonel Dent and his party played, what word they chose, how they acquitted themselves, I no longer remember. But I still see the consultation which followed each scene. I see Mr. Rochester turn to Miss Ingram, and Miss Ingram to him. I see her incline her head toward him till the jetty curls almost touch his shoulder and wave against his cheek. I hear their mutual whisperings. I recall their interchanged glances, and something even of the feeling roused by the spectacle returns in memory at this moment. I have told you, reader, that I had learned to love Mr. Rochester. I could not unlove him now, merely because I found that he had ceased to notice me, because I might pass hours in his presence and he would never once turn his eyes in my direction, because I saw all his attentions appropriated by a great lady who scorned to touch me with the hem of her robes as she passed, who, if ever her dark and imperious eye fell on me by chance, would withdraw it instantly, as from an object too mean to merit observation. I could not unlove him, because I felt sure he would soon marry this very lady, because I read daily in her proud security in his intentions respecting her, because I witnessed hourly in him a style of courtship which, if careless and choosing rather to be sought than to seek, was yet in its very carelessness captivating, and in its very pride irresistible. There was nothing to cool or banish love in these circumstances, though much to create despair. Much too, you will think, reader, to engender jealousy if a woman in my position could presume to be jealous of a woman in Miss Ingram's. But I was not jealous, or very rarely. The nature of the pain I suffered could not be explained by that word. Miss Ingram was a mark beneath jealousy. She was too inferior to excite the feeling. Pardon the seeming paradox. I mean what I say. She was very showy, but she was not genuine. She had a fine person, many brilliant attainments, but her mind was poor, her heart barren by nature. Nothing bloomed spontaneously on that soil. No unforced natural fruit delighted by its freshness. She was not good. She was not original. She used to repeat sounding phrases from books. She never offered nor had an opinion of her own. She advocated a high tone of sentiment, but she did not know the sensations of sympathy and pity. Tenderness and truth were not in her. Too often she betrayed this by the undue vent she gave to a spiteful antipathy she had conceived against little Adele, pushing her away with some contumelious epithet if she happened to approach her, sometimes ordering her from the room and always treating her with coldness and acrimony. Other eyes besides mine watched these manifestations of character, watched them closely, keenly, shrewdly. Yes, the future bridegroom, Mr. Rochester himself, exercised over his intended a ceaseless surveillance. And it was from this sagacity, this guardedness of his, this perfect, clear consciousness of his fair one's defects, this obvious absence of passion in his sentiments toward her, that my ever-torturing pain arose. I saw he was going to marry her, for family, perhaps political reasons, because her rank and connections suited him. I felt he had not given her his love, and that her qualifications were ill-adapted to win from him that treasure. This was the point. This was where the nerve was touched and teased. This was where the fever was sustained and fed. She could not charm him. If she had managed the victory at once, and he had yielded and sincerely laid his heart at her feet, I should have covered my face, turned to the wall, and figuratively have died to them. If Miss Ingram had been a good and noble woman, endowed with force, fervor, kindness, sense, I should have had one vital struggle with two tigers, jealousy and despair. Then, my heart torn out and devoured, I should have admired her, acknowledged her excellence, and been quiet for the rest of my days. And the more absolute her superiority, the deeper would have been my admiration, the more truly tranquil my quiescence. But as matters really stood, to watch Miss Ingram's efforts at fascinating Mr. Rochester, to witness their repeated failure, herself unconscious that they did fall, vainly fancying that each shaft landed at the mark, and infatuatedly pluming herself on success, when her pride and self-complacency withheld further and further what she wished to allure. To witness this was to be at once under ceaseless excitation and ruthless restraint. Because when she failed, I saw how she might have succeeded. Arrows that continually glanced off from Mr. Rochester's breast. Arrows that continually glanced off from Mr. Rochester's breast and fell harmless at his feet might, I knew, if shot by a surer hand, have quivered keen in his proud heart, have called love into his stern eye and softness into his sardonic face. Or better still, without weapons, a silent conquest might have been won. Why can she not influence him more when she is privileged to draw so near to him? I asked myself. Surely she cannot truly like him or not like him with true affection. If she did, she need not coin her smiles so lavishly, flash her glances so unremittingly, manufacture airs so elaborate, graces so multitudinous. It seems to me that she might, by merely sitting quietly at his side, saying little and looking less, get nigher his heart. I have seen in his face a far different expression from that which hardens it now, while she is so vivaciously accosting him. But then it came of itself. It was not elicited by meretricious arts and calculated maneuvers, and one had but to accept it, to answer what he asked without pretension, to address him when needful without grimace. And it increased and grew kinder and more genial, and she managed to please him when they are married. I do not think she will manage it, and yet it might be managed, and his wife might, I verily believe, be the very happiest woman the sun shines on. I have not yet said anything condemnatory of Mr. Rochester's project of marrying for interest and connections. It surprised me when I first discovered that such was his intention. I had thought him a man unlikely to be influenced by motives so commonplace in his choice of a wife. But the longer I considered the position, education, etc., the parties, the less I felt justified in judging and blaming either him or Miss Ingram for acting in conformity to ideas and principles instilled into them, doubtless, from their childhood. All their class held these principles. I suppose then they had reasons for holding them such as I could not fathom. It seemed to me that, were I a gentleman like him, I would take to my bosom only such a wife as I could love. But the very obviousness of the advantages to the husband's own happiness offered by this plan convinced me that there must be arguments against its general adoption, of which I was quite ignorant. Otherwise, I felt sure all the world would act as I wished to act. But in other points as well as this, I was growing very lenient to my master. I was forgetting all his faults, for which I had once kept a sharp lookout. It had formerly been my endeavor to study all sides of his character, to take the bad with the good, and from the just weighing of both, to form an equitable judgment. Now I saw no bad. The sarcasm that had repelled, the harshness that had startled me once, were only like keen condiments in a choice dish. Their presence was pungent, but their absence would be felt as comparatively insipid. And as for the vague something, was it a sinister or a sorrowful, a designing or desponding expression that opened upon the careful observer, now and then in his eye, and closed again, before one could fathom the strange depth partially disclosed. That something which used to make me fear and shrink, as if I had been wandering among volcanic-looking hills, and had suddenly felt the ground quiver and seen it gape. That something I, at intervals, beheld still, and with throbbing heart, but not with palsied nerves. Instead of wishing to shun, I longed only to dare to divine it. And I thought Miss Ingram happy, because one day she might look into the abyss at her leisure, explore its secrets, and analyze their nature. Meantime, I saw only them, heard only their discourse, and considered only their movements of importance. The rest of the party were occupied with their own separate interests and pleasures. The ladies Lynn and Ingram continued to consort in solemn conferences, where they nodded their two turbans at each other and held up their forehands in confronting gestures of surprise, or mystery, or horror, depending on the theme on which their gossip ran, like a pair of magnified puppets. Mild Mrs. Dent talked with good-natured Mrs. Eshton, and the two sometimes bestowed a courteous word or smile on me. Sir George Lynn, Colonel Dent, and Mr. Eshton discussed politics or country affairs or justice business. Lord Ingram flirted with Amy Eshton. Louisa played and sang to and with one of the Messrs. Lynn, and Mary Ingram listened languidly to the gallant speeches of the other. Sometimes all, as with one consent, suspended their byplay to observe and listen to the principal actors. For after all, Mr. Rochester, and because closely associated with him, Miss Ingram, wore the life and soul of the party. If he were absent from the room an hour, a perceptible dullness seemed to steal over the spirits of his guests, and his re-entrance was sure to give a fresh impulse to the vivacity of conversation. The want of his animating influence appeared to be peculiarly felt one day that he had been summoned to Millcote on business, and was not likely to return till late. The afternoon was wet. A walk the party had proposed to take to the gypsy camp, lately pitched on the common beyond Hay, was subsequently deferred. Some of the gentlemen were gone to the stables. The younger ones, together with the younger ladies, were playing billiards in the billiard room. The dowagers Ingram and Lynn sought solace in a quiet game at cards. Blanche Ingram, after having repelled by supercilious taciturnity some efforts of Mrs. Dent and Mrs. Eshton to draw her into conversation, had first murmured over some sentimental tunes and airs on the piano, and then, having fetched a novel from the library, had flung herself in haughty listlessness on a sofa, and prepared to beguile, by the spell of fiction, the tedious hours of absence. The room and the house were silent. Only now and then the merriment of the billiard players was heard from above. It was verging on dusk, and the clock had already given warning of the hour to dress for dinner, when little Adele, who had knelt by me in the drawing-room window seat, exclaimed, "Voila, Monsieur returned!" I turned. The others, too, looked up from their several occupations, for at the same time a crunching of wheels and a splashing tramp of horse hooves became audible on the wet gravel. A post-chaise was approaching. "What can possess him to come back in that style?" said Miss Ingram. "He rode Mesrour, the black horse, did he not, when he went out? And Pilot was with him. What has he done with the animals?" As she said this, she approached her tall person and ample garments so near the window that I was obliged to bend back, almost to the breaking of my observe me at first. But when she did, she curled her lip and moved to another casement. The post-chaise stopped. The driver rang the doorbell, and a gentleman alighted, attired in traveling garb, but it was not Mr. Rochester. It was a tall, fashionable-looking man, a stranger. "Provoking!" exclaimed Miss Ingram. "You tiresome monkey!" apostrophizing Adele. "Who perched you up at the window to give false intelligence?" And she cast on me an angry glance, as if I were in fault. Some parleying was audible in the hall, and soon the newcomer entered. He bowed to Lady Ingram, as deeming, "As I come at an inopportune time, madam," said he, "when my friend Mr. Rochester is from home. But I arrive from a long journey, and I think I may presume so far on old and intimate acquaintance as to install myself here till he returns." His manner was polite. His accent in speaking struck me as being somewhat unusual, not precisely foreign, but still not altogether English. His age might be about Mr. Rochester's, between 30 and 40. His complexion was singularly sallow. Otherwise, he was a fine-looking man, at first sight especially. On closer examination, you noticed something in his face that displeased, or rather that failed to please. His features were regular, but too relaxed. His eye was large and well cut, but the life looking out of it was a tame, vacant life. At least so I thought. The sound of the dressing bell dispersed the party. It was not till after dinner that I saw him again. He then seemed quite at his ease. But I liked his physiognomy even less than before. It struck me as being, at the same time, unsettled and inanimate. His eye wandered. Sorry about that. His eye wandered and had no meaning its wandering. This gave him an odd look, such as I never remembered to have seen. For a handsome and not an unamiable-looking man, he repelled me exceedingly. There was no power in that smooth-skinned face of a full oval shape, no firmness in that aquiline nose and small cherry mouth. There was no thought on the low, even forehead, no command in that blank brown eye. As I sat in my usual nook and looked at him with the light of girandoles, candle holders set in the wall, on the kept shrinking still nearer as if he were cold, I compared him with Mr. Rochester. I think, with deference be it spoken, the contrast could not be much greater between a sleek gander and a fierce falcon, between a meek sheep and the rough-coated, keen-eyed dog, its guardian. He had spoken of Mr. Rochester as an old friend.
Yet another traveler.
A curious friendship theirs must have been.
How did you
A
get
pointed
in?
illustration, indeed, of the old adage that extremes meet.
Seems you have something rather interesting.
2 or 3 of the gentlemen sat near him, and I caught at times scraps of their conversation across the room. At first I could not make much sense of what I heard, for the discourse of Louisa Eshton and Mary Ingram, who sat nearer to me, confused the fragmentary sentences that reached me at intervals. These last were discussing the stranger. They both called him a beautiful man. Louisa said he was a love of a creature, and she adored him. And Mary instanced his pretty little mouth and nice nose as her ideal of the charming. "And what a sweet-tempered forehead he has," cried Louisa. "So smooth. None of those frowning irregularities I dislike so much. and such a placid eye and smile. And then, to my great relief, Mr. Henry Lynn summoned them to the other side of the room to settle some point about the deferred excursion to Hay Common. I was now able to concentrate my attention on the group by the fire, and I presently gathered that the newcomer was called Mr. Mason, that I learned that he was but just arrived in England, and that he came from some hot country, which was the reason, doubtless, his face was so sallow, and that he sat so near the hearth and wore a surtout in the house. Presently the words Jamaica, Kingston, Spanish Town indicated the West Indies as his residence, and it was with no little surprise I gathered, ere long, that he had there first seen and became acquainted with Mr. Rochester. He spoke of his friend's dislike of the burning heats, the hurricanes, and rainy seasons of that region. I knew Mr. Rochester had been a traveler. Mrs. Fairfax had said so, but I thought the continent of Europe had bounded his wanderings. Till now, I had never heard a hint given of visits to more distant shores. I was pondering these things when an incident, and a somewhat unexpected one, broke the thread of my musings. Mr. Mason, shivering as someone chanced to open the door, asked for more coal to be put on the fire, which had burned out its flame, though its mass of cinders. Someone who brought the coal, in going out, stopped near Mr. Eshton's chair, and said something to him in a low voice, of which I heard only the words, "Old woman, quite troublesome." "Tell her she shall be put in the stocks if she does not take herself off," replied the magistrate. "No, stop," interrupted Colonel Dent. "Don't send her away, Eshton. We might turn the thing to account. Better consult the ladies." And speaking aloud, he continued, "Ladies, you talked of going to Hay Common to visit the gypsy camp. Sam here says that one of the old Mother Bunches is in the servants' hall at this moment, and insists upon being brought in before the quality to tell them their fortunes. Would you like to see her?" "Surely, Colonel," cried Lady Ingram, "you would not encourage such a low impostor. Dismiss her, by all means, at once." "But I cannot persuade her to go away, my lady," said the footman, "nor can any of the servants. Mrs. Fairfax is with her just now, entreating her to be gone, but she has taken a chair in the chimney corner, and says nothing shall stir her from it till she gets leave to come in here." It's Mrs. Eshton. "To tell the gentry their fortune, she says, ma'am, and she swears she must and will do it." "Ooh, what is she like?" inquired the Mrs. Eshton in a breath. "A shockingly ugly old creature, miss, almost as black as a crock." "Why, she's a real sorceress," cried Frederick Lynn. "Let us have her in, of course." "To be sure," rejoined her brother. "It would be 1,000 pities to throw away such a chance of fun." "My dear boys, what are you thinking about?" exclaimed Mrs. Lynn, or Lady Lynn. "I cannot possibly countenance any such inconsistent proceeding," chimed in the Dowager Ingram. "Indeed, mamma, but you can, and will," pronounced the haughty voice of Blanche as she turned round on the piano stool, where till now she had sat silent, apparently examining sundry sheets of music. "I have a curiosity to hear my fortune told. Therefore, Sam, Blanche, recollect." "I do. I recollect all you can suggest, and I must have my will. Quick, Sam." Yes, yes, yes," cried all the juveniles, both ladies and gentlemen. "Let her come. It will be excellent sport." The footman still lingered. "She looks such a rough one," said he. "Go!" Excitement instantly seized the whole party. A running fire of raillery and jests was proceeding when Sam returned. "She won't come in," says he. "She says it's not her mission to appear before the vulgar herd. Them's her words. I must show her into a room by herself, and then those who wish to consult her must go to her one by one." "You see now, my queenly Blanche," began Lady Ingram, "she encroaches. Be advised, my angel girl, and—" "Show her into the library, of course," cut in the angel girl. "It is not my mission to listen to her before the vulgar herd either. I mean to have her all to myself. Is there a fire in the library?" "Yes, ma'am, but she looks such a tinkler." "Cease that chatter, blockhead, and do my bidding." Again Sam vanished, and mystery, animation, expectation rose to full flow once more. "She's ready now," said the footman as he reappeared. "She wishes to know who will be her first visitor." "I think I had better just look in upon her before any of the ladies go," said Colonel Dent. Tell her, Sam, a gentleman is coming. Sam went, "Oh, my best. Oh, my dearest. Pause. Reflect," was her mamma's cry. But she swept past her in stately silence, passed through the door which Colonel Dent held open, and we heard her enter the library. A comparative silence ensued. Lady Ingram thought it the cast, the appropriate thing to do, to wring her hands, which she did accordingly. Miss Mary declared she felt for her part she never dared venture. Amy and Louisa Eshton tittered under their breath and looked a little frightened. The minutes passed very slowly. 15 were counted before the library door again opened. Miss Ingram returned to us through the arch. Would she laugh? Would she take it as a joke? All eyes met her with a glance of eager curiosity, and she met all eyes with one of rebuff and coldness. She looked neither flurried nor merry. She walked stiffly to her seat and took it in silence. "Well, Blanche," said Lord Ingram. "What did she say, sister?" asked Mary. "What did you think? How do you feel? Is she a real fortune teller?" demanded the Mrs. Eshton. Now, good people," returned Miss Ingram, "don't. Organs of wonder and credulity are easily excited. You seem, by the importance you all, my good mamma included, ascribe to this matter, absolutely to believe we have a genuine witch in the house, who is in close alliance with the old gentleman. I have seen a gypsy vagabond. She has practiced in hackneyed fashion the science of palmistry, and told me what such people usually tell. My whim is gratified, and now I think Mr. Eshton will do well to put the hag in the stocks tomorrow morning, as he threatened." Miss Ingram took a book, leaned back in her chair, and so declined further conversation. I watched her for nearly half an hour. During all that time, she never turned a page, and her face grew momentarily darker, more dissatisfied, and more sourly expressive of disappointment. She had obviously not heard anything to her advantage, and it seemed to me from her prolonged fit of gloom and taciturnity that she herself, notwithstanding her professed indifference, attached undue importance to whatever revelations had been made to her. Meanwhile, Mary Ingram, Amy, and Louisa Eshton declared they dare not go alone, and yet they all wished to go. A negotiation was opened through the medium of the ambassador, Sam, and after much pacing to and fro till, I think, the said Sam's calves must have ached with the exercise, permission was at last, with great difficulty, extorted from the rigorous Sybil for the three to wait upon her in a body. Their visit was not so still as Miss Ingram's had been. We heard hysterical giggling and little shrieks proceeding from the library. And at the end of about 20 minutes, they burst the door open and came running across the hall as if they were half scared out of their wits. "I'm sure she is something not right," they cried, one and all. "She told us such things. She knows all about us." And they sunk breathless into the various seats the gentleman hastened to bring them. Pressed for further explanation, they declared she had told them of things they had said and done when they were mere children, described books and ornaments they had in their boudoirs at home, keepsakes that different relations had presented to them. They affirmed that she had even divined their thoughts, and had whispered in the ear of each the name of the person she liked best in the world, and informed them of what they most wished for. Here the gentleman interposed with earnest petitions to be further enlightened on these last named points, but they got only blushes, ejaculations, tremors, and titters in return for their importunity. The matrons, meantime, offered vinaigrettes and wielded fans, and again reiterated the expression of their concern that their warning had not been taken in time, and the elder gentlemen laughed, and the younger urged their services on the agitated fair ones. In the midst of the tumult, and while my eyes and ears were fully engaged in the scene before me, I heard a "hem" close at my elbow. I turned and saw Sam. "If you please, miss, the gypsy declares that there is another young single lady in the room who has not been to her yet, and she swears she will not go till she has seen all. I thought it must be you. There was no one else for it. What shall I tell her?" "Oh, I will go by all means," I answered, and I was glad of the unexpected opportunity to gratify my much excited curiosity. I slipped out of the room. unobserved by any eye, for the company were gathered in one mass about the trembling trio just returned, and I closed the door quietly behind me. "If you like, miss," said Sam, "I'll wait in the hall for you, and if she frightens you, just call and I'll come in." "No, Sam, return to the kitchen. I am not in the least afraid, nor was I, but I was a good deal interested and excited." And that concludes Chapter 18 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Thanks for coming today. A wonderful, wonderful day. Let's see. Oops. Take care. I switched out I hope I didn't flip that around. I switched to a different recording device, so I hope I didn't just flip. Bye. Hi, everybody. It's Christina Wainwright, the manager of the PV Library and from San Diego Public. And I wanted to welcome you back to day 16, I think it is now. We're on chapter 19 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And today's going to be a relatively short chapter, so I'm not going to feel too guilty about talking a little bit about our tea. Today's tea is a loose leaf butterbeer tea. I've never tried it before. I'm really excited. It's a gift from a friend. And in case anyone here is not a Harry Potter viewer, butterbeer is a beverage that they drink in Harry Potter. It is delightful and magically delicious. It's like a lucky charm of beverages. Okay, maybe that's not a great description of it, but I'm excited. I've never been to the Magical Wizard of Harry Potter, so I've never had a real butterbeer. So I'm hoping that this tea will be as awesome as I could get at Hogwarts or at oh no! Hogsmeade? I just was having like a terrible blank moment. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and try their butterbeer tea. Yeah, but it's a loose leaf tea. It's called butterbeer. It just, in case you're curious as to what's in it to make the magic butterbeer, it says it's made of walrus, caramel, hazelnut, calendula petals, and natural flavors. Whatever those are. So let's go see it and give it a try. I've been letting it steep. It's said to let it steep for 7 to 14 minutes, and I want to give it a good chance to get nice. Plum? I don't know if that's a great way to describe it. The caramel flavor is subtle on there. It's not really sweet. This one might be something to try again with some sugar to see if it